I inherited the money. I inherited the God-given best looks in the world today.
He was already a pro when Mick Foley stepped into his world, but Ric Flair called him a glorified stuntman anyway. That insult hurt. It cut deep. Foley built a career on telling stories through pain, not just taking bumps for cheap thrills. He risked his body to make moments feel real. He put himself through hell to give fans something they would remember forever. But Flair dismissed it all with two words: glorified stuntman. The comment became public. It appeared in Flair's autobiography. Fans read it, wrestlers read it, and Foley felt the sting of disrespect from a man he had once looked up to. The tension became real. It simmered for years. And in 2006 at SummerSlam, Flair found himself lying in a pile of thumbtacks at age 57, trying to prove he could survive Foley's violent world. This was the Nature Boy, brilliant in the ring, capable of making anyone look like $1 million, but also proud to a fault, arrogant, unwilling to admit that other styles, other approaches could be just as valid as his own. He could make you a star, absolutely, but he could also cut you down with a single phrase. He could elevate you one moment and dismiss you the next. Quick thing, if you are enjoying this, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. It really helps. Now listen to what happened next. That match at SummerSlam was not just about winning, it was about Flair proving a point. He took those thumbtacks because his ego demanded it. He wanted to show that he could do what Foley did, only better. The barbed wire bat came out, the blood flowed freely, the violence escalated beyond what anyone expected from a 57-year-old man. And Flair, the man who built his legend on technical wrestling and psychological mind games, embraced the chaos completely. He took the pain, he absorbed the punishment, and in doing so, he tried to prove that his way was not the only way, but it was still the best way. Even in Foley's world, Flair wanted to be the one who controlled the narrative. But the story of Flair in these legends goes far deeper than one grudge match built on real animosity. For decades, spanning multiple generations and multiple companies, the first time facing Ric Flair was the ultimate test. It was a rite of passage that every aspiring main eventer had to go through. You either survived it and became a star, legitimized in the eyes of the fans and the boys in the back, or you crumbled under the pressure and stayed in the mid-card forever. Flair was the gatekeeper, the litmus test, the standard by which all others were measured, the man who decided, through his performance and his influence, if you belonged at the top. This is the story of wrestling's biggest names and what happened the first time they stepped into the ring with the Nature Boy. Some of them he built up, guiding them through matches that made their careers. Others he tested relentlessly, pushing them to their limits to see if they had what it took. And a few he tried to keep down, protecting his spot and the spots of his friends in the old guard. We will go through each encounter chronologically and see what it reveals about Flair. Was he helping these people reach their potential, or was he making sure he stayed on top of the mountain? The answer, as you will see, is complicated. It is both. And that duality is what made Flair so effective and so controversial throughout his entire career. Let us start with Sting in 1988, at a moment when professional wrestling in America was at a crossroads. Jim Crockett Promotions was dying a slow, painful death. Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation were taking over the entire country, territory by territory, promotion by promotion. WrestleMania was printing money through the pay-per-view model. The spectacle, the celebrity involvement, the national exposure, all of it was working. JCP, the last major holdout of the old National Wrestling Alliance system, needed a counterattack. Their strategy was desperate but clever. They would give away a pay-per-view quality match for free on television, airing it directly opposite WrestleMania 4. The gamble was enormous. If it failed, they would have given away their biggest asset for nothing. But if it worked, they could prove that wrestling fans still wanted pure in-ring competition, not just cartoon characters and celebrity cameos. The event was called Clash of the Champions. The match was Ric Flair, the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, versus Sting, the rising young star, for the title. But for this plan to work, the match had to be absolutely incredible. It had to be so good that fans would choose it over WrestleMania. And Sting, the colorful, high-energy powerhouse from Venice Beach, had to look like the future of the company. He had to seem like a credible threat to the most dominant champion in the world. Flair was the tradition, the establishment, the suit-wearing, limousine-riding, jet-flying champion who represented everything the NWA had been for decades. Sting was neon face paint and screaming energy. He was different, new, unconventional. The contrast was massive, and it was intentional. When the bell rang in the Greensboro Coliseum, Flair did not rush in for a lockup. He circled Sting slowly, deliberately. He stared at him with an expression of confusion and disdain. Sting later said Flair looked at him like he was something from outer space, like he did not belong in the same ring, breathing the same air, competing for the same prize. That reaction was not accidental. It was not Flair being caught off guard. Flair was sending a message to the crowd and to Sting himself. This painted-up kid with the spiked hair and the frantic energy does not belong in my ring. He is not legitimate. He is not worthy. Sting realized in that moment that he could not just out-wrestle Flair. He had to match his charisma. He had to speak back in his own language, using his own energy and personality to counter Flair's dismissiveness. So Sting beat on his chest. He fired up with intensity. He screamed and showed the crowd that he was not intimidated. He showed Flair he was not just some flash in the pan who would wilt under pressure. The match went 45 minutes, a full Broadway in wrestling terminology. In professional wrestling, a time limit draw with the champion is one of the hardest things to pull off successfully. You have to keep the crowd invested and engaged for nearly an hour without giving them a definitive finish. One mistake, one lull in the action, and you lose them completely. Flair controlled the pace early, as he always did. He was the veteran leading the rookie through every sequence, every transition, every near fall. He dictated when to speed up, when to slow down, when to give the crowd hope, and when to take it away. But as the clock ticked down towards zero, the momentum shifted palpably. The crowd started to believe. Sting locked in his Scorpion Deathlock submission hold, his finishing maneuver. Flair was trapped in the center of the ring with nowhere to go. The visual was perfect and devastating. The master technician, the man who claimed to be the best wrestler in the world, was caught in the young challenger's finishing move as time ran out. The fans believed Sting should be the champion. They felt robbed when the time limit expired. Sting said years later that he knew Flair was really sweating when that hold was locked in. He felt the shift. He felt like he should have won, like the title should have been his. And that is exactly what Flair wanted the audience to feel. By not beating Sting, by allowing the match to end in a draw with Sting on the verge of victory, Flair elevated him to a new level. He gave him the rub, as they say in the business. But notice how it happened. Notice the details. It was still on Flair's terms. Flair controlled the story from beginning to end. Flair decided the pace, the structure, the emotional beats. Flair made Sting look great, absolutely, but Flair stayed in charge of the entire narrative. The match put Sting on the map nationally. It successfully countered WrestleMania 4, drawing a huge television rating, but it also showed the pattern that would repeat for years to come with every major star Flair helped create. Flair was brilliant at making stars, perhaps the best ever at it, but he was also the one holding the keys to the kingdom. He decided who got elevated and when. He decided who was ready and who was not. And that power, that control, was something he never fully relinquished. Now go back even further, all the way to June 1977, to the Mid-Atlantic territory where Flair was still building his reputation. Ricky Steamboat was green, inexperienced, still learning the basics of the business. He had only been in the territory for a few months, working preliminary matches and trying to figure out his character. Flair was already the polished main eventer, the Mid-Atlantic television champion, a rising star who everyone knew would be NWA World Champion someday. One day during a television taping, Steamboat walked onto the set and interrupted a Flair promo. It was bold. It was risky. Rookies did not normally interrupt established stars unless they were given permission to do so, but Steamboat did it anyway. Flair, sensing an opportunity and also wanting to establish his dominance, tried to big league the rookie. He challenged Steamboat's nerve. He asked if Steamboat was anxious, if he really thought he could handle Flair in the ring. The implication was clear. You are not ready, kid. You are out of your depth. Steamboat fired back with raw, genuine emotion. He said he had been watching Flair for 3 months. He said he knew he could beat him. Then he said something that surprised everyone watching, including the veteran announcers Bob Caudle and David Crockett. I want you so bad. The intensity was real. The fire was genuine. It was not a scripted line delivered by a nervous rookie. It was a young man who truly believed he could compete with the best and who was demanding his chance to prove it. That segment set up their first singles match on June 15, 1977 in Raleigh, North Carolina. Steamboat admitted years later that he was very green at the time, barely scratching the surface of what he would eventually become. He said he was the perfect good guy, the consummate babyface, and Flair was the perfect bad guy, the consummate heel. Early on in that match, Steamboat was all ears, listening to Flair call the match in the ring, letting Flair guide him through the sequence and spots. But Flair also tested him. He wanted to see if Steamboat could handle the pressure, if he could adapt on the fly, if he had the instincts necessary to succeed. Greg Valentine, Flair's tag team partner, was on commentary for the match. Valentine predicted that Steamboat would crumble under Flair's suplex, a devastating vertical suplex that Flair used as one of his signature moves. In that era, the suplex often finished matches outright. It was a big deal. When Steamboat kicked out of it, refusing to stay down, the commentary team team was shocked. The crowd was shocked. Valentine stumbled over his words trying to explain how Steamboat survived. By allowing the rookie to kick out of his big move in their very first meeting, Flair validated Steamboat as a legitimate threat. He told the audience, without saying a word, that this kid has something special. But again, it was Flair's decision. Flair chose to put Steamboat over in that moment. Flair controlled when and how Steamboat looked strong. And 12 years later, in 1989, Flair and Steamboat would have their legendary trilogy of matches that many historians still consider the greatest series of matches in wrestling history. 3 matches across 3 months. Chi-Town Rumble on February 20th, where Steamboat defeated Flair for the NWA World title. Clash of the Champions 6 on April 2nd, a 2 out of 3 falls match that lasted 55 minutes. And Wrestle War on May 7th, where Flair regained the title. Each one is considered an absolute classic, a masterpiece of in-ring storytelling. Steamboat noted that Flair had great ears for the crowd, meaning he could sense their reactions in real time and adjust the pacing of the match accordingly. These matches relied entirely on athletic storytelling, on holds and counters, and near falls and drama. There were no elaborate skits or backstage segments or celebrity interference, just 2 men at the peak of their abilities, working together to create something timeless. They proved that both men were at the absolute top of their craft. But look at the bigger picture, the long-term arc. Flair helped build Steamboat up in 1977, giving him credibility and validation when he was just starting out. Then in 1989, when Steamboat finally won the NWA World title from him in a classic match, it felt earned. It felt like the culmination of a 12-year journey. Flair gave him that credibility, that legitimacy, but Flair also took it back. At Wrestle War, just a few months later, Flair regained the title and Steamboat dropped back down the card. The point is clear. Flair could make you a star. He could give you the match of your life. He could validate you in the eyes of the wrestling world, but he also stayed on top. He always found his way back to the championship, back to the main event, back to the spotlight. Fast forward to 2002, to a very different Ric Flair. This was not the confident, swaggering nature boy of the 1980s. This was a broken man. World Championship Wrestling had collapsed in March 2001, purchased by Vince McMahon for pennies on the pound. The final years of WCW had been traumatic for Flair. Backstage politics, humiliating booking decisions, a hostile management structure led by people who did not respect him or understand his value. Ridiculous storylines that made him look foolish. All of it eroded his self-confidence bit by bit. When he joined the WWF, now rebranded as WWE, he came in primarily as an on-screen authority figure, a co-owner character alongside Vince McMahon. He was not expected to wrestle full-time. He was not expected to have competitive matches. He genuinely believed his days as an elite in-ring performer were over. He thought the magic was gone, that he was too old, too broken, too far removed from his prime. Then the Undertaker made a request. He specifically asked to work a program with Flair for WrestleMania 18. Undertaker, one of the most respected and influential wrestlers in WWE history, saw value in Flair that Flair did not see in himself. Undertaker believed that Flair still had something to offer, that he could still deliver on the biggest stage. The storyline mirrored this backstage reality perfectly. On the March 11, 2002 episode of Raw, Flair cut a promo attempting to avoid the match altogether. He used his authority role, his position as co-owner, to try to cancel the bout. He told Undertaker that while he had made the match a no disqualification match, he was giving Undertaker the night off that evening. That phrase, giving you the night off, became significant in wrestling lore. Flair thought he was protecting himself, buying time, keeping distance between himself and a physical confrontation he was not sure he could handle. But Undertaker, in character as the menacing American badass version of the Dead Man, twisted the narrative. He threatened to rip Flair limb from limb at WrestleMania if Flair did not face him like a man. Flair was terrified, both in storyline and in reality. The match at WrestleMania 18 in the Toronto Skydome was a bloody, chaotic brawl. It was designed specifically to hide Flair's aging physical limitations while highlighting his greatest remaining strength, his ability to garner sympathy from the crowd. The structure was simple. Undertaker would dominate with power and brutality, and Flair would fight from underneath, refusing to quit, bleeding and suffering, but never giving up. Undertaker later revealed in interviews a specific physical detail about this match that underscores just how hard Flair was working. Despite being 53 years old and wrestling in a shirt to hide his age physique, Flair delivered a spinebuster, a signature power move that Undertaker described as one of the hardest ones of his entire career. Flair was not working light, as older wrestlers often do to protect themselves and their opponents. He was not holding back. He was fighting for his professional life, trying to prove that he still belonged, that the Nature Boy was not just a nostalgic memory. The match is widely credited by wrestling historians and by Flair himself with with restoring his confidence. Even though he lost the match, even though Undertaker pinned him clean in the center of the ring, the reaction from over 60,000 fans in attendance proved to Flair that he still mattered. The Nature Boy still had currency. The fans still cared. This match launched the final act of Flair's career, a run that would last another 6 years and lead directly to his involvement in the Evolution faction, alongside Triple H, Randy Orton, and Batista. But think about what this story reveals. Flair was so tied to his identity as a wrestler, so dependent on that validation, that losing it almost destroyed him mentally. He needed others, specifically Undertaker, to restore him. He needed that external validation to believe in himself again. And even at 53 years old, even with his body breaking down, he leaned on violence and emotion and sheer willpower to survive and prove his worth. The next year in 2003, Flair faced Triple H for the World Heavyweight Championship in a match that perfectly encapsulates Flair's internal struggle. By this point, Triple H was the dominant force in WWE, the top heel, the world champion, the man around whom the entire Raw brand was built. Flair was his manager and confidant in the Evolution faction. On screen, Triple H was the star, and Flair was the supporting player, the legend from the past helping the present. But backstage, the dynamic was more complicated. Flair was still a legend, still revered by everyone in the company. The match was booked for the May 19, 2003 episode of Raw in Greenville, South Carolina. This was Flair country, deep in the heart of the old Mid-Atlantic territory where Flair had built his legend. But despite the home field advantage, despite the fact that the crowd would be on his side, Flair was terrified. He felt too old to be a credible challenger for the title. He was battling imposter syndrome hard, convinced that he would embarrass himself and expose the fact that he was past his prime. Right before they walked through the curtain to enter the arena, Triple H grabbed Flair and gave him a speech that has become famous in wrestling circles. He told Flair it was not 2003, it was 1983. They were not in Greenville for a television taping. They were in Greensboro for Starrcade, the NWA's biggest show of the year. Flair was not a manager or a sideshow. He was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion in his prime, at the peak of his powers. This psychological trigger was brilliantly designed to strip away all the years of trauma and self-doubt and tap directly into Flair's muscle memory, into the core of who he was as a performer. And it worked like magic. When they walked through that curtain, when Flair's music hit and the crowd erupted, he became the Nature Boy again. The years melted away. The doubt vanished. He strutted and posed and worked the crowd like he was 35 years old again. The match itself lasted just over 7 minutes. Triple H retained the title, as was always the plan, but the match achieved its real goal. It allowed Flair to shed the manager role for one night and perform as a main event wrestler in his homeland, in front of a crowd that adored him. The reaction was enormous, rapturous, treating the contest with the gravity and importance of a pay-per-view main event. The crowd believed in the possibility, however remote, that Flair might actually win. But again, look at the pattern that emerges. Flair's identity was so wrapped up in being the champion, being the man, being the Nature Boy, that he could only function at his highest level when he was reminded of his glory days. He lived in the past. He needed that mirror, that reflection of who he used to be, to access his greatness. And Triple H, the younger star who was supposed to be learning from Flair, had to be the one to give it to him. The roles were reversed. The mentor needed the student to remind him of his own power. Kurt Angle faced Flair in 2005, and their pairing offered a fascinating study in contrasting philosophies. Angle was an Olympic gold medalist, a legitimate athlete who came from the world of amateur wrestling, where everything was real, where the outcome was determined by genuine competition. Flair was the ultimate showman, the man who built his career on smoke and mirrors, on theatrical psychology and conditioning the audience to react to specific cues. Their first televised singles match was on the June 27, 2005 episode of Raw. Angle later talked extensively about the stylistic clash and what he learned from working with Flair. He specifically criticized Flair's signature knee drop as nonsense from a combat sports perspective. The move involves the attacker jumping and dropping their own knee onto a prone opponent's head. From a purely physical standpoint, the move exposes the attacker's knee to more potential damage than it inflicts on the opponent. It makes no logical sense as an offensive maneuver, but Angle admitted, with a mixture of frustration and admiration, that it worked perfectly in the context of pro wrestling. The knee drop looked more painful than it actually was. Angle said he legitimately rubbed his knee after Flair performed it on him, selling the impact, even though it barely hurt at all. The move worked because the crowd had been conditioned for 30 years to react to it, to believe it was devastating. Flair taught Angle a crucial lesson about professional wrestling that his amateur background had not prepared him for. Getting over, becoming popular with the fans, was not about what you actually did in terms of real physical damage or athletic prowess. It was about how you made the audience feel. It was about their perception, their emotional investment, talent, their belief in the story you were telling. Their rivalry also included a memorable segment known as the Woo-Off, where the two men stood face-to-face in the ring trading Flair's signature catchphrase back and forth. Angle, known for his intensity and his obsession with high-impact moves like suplexes and moonsaults, found himself engaged in a battle of pure charisma. He admitted in interviews that the segments were fantastic, noting with amazement how Flair could control an entire arena with a single syllable, with a simple sound that meant nothing out of context. For Angle, who was constantly trying to prove himself as the best technical wrestler in the world, this was a masterclass in longevity and crowd control. Flair showed him that you did not need to risk your body with dangerous moves every single night. You did not need to constantly escalate the violence or the athleticism. Sometimes, often, the simple things were the most effective. A strut, a woo, a well-timed Flair flop. These things, performed with confidence and charisma, could generate bigger reactions than any suplex. But the lesson was also this, and Angle understood it clearly. Flair's power was not about clean sport or legitimate competition. It was about conditioning the audience over time, about performance and presentation, about controlling their reactions through repetition and consistency. In other words, Flair's greatness was built on theatrical tricks, not on pure athleticism. And that worked. It worked brilliantly because he mastered the theater of professional wrestling better than almost anyone in history. Steve Austin's story with Flair is completely different from the others, rooted not in a specific match or moment, but in years of frustration and resentment. Before he was Stone Cold Steve Austin, the biggest star of the Attitude Era, he was stunning Steve Austin in World Championship Wrestling in the early 1990s. He was a talented technician with movie star looks and solid in-ring skills. He held the WCW television title and seemed destined for greatness, but he was stuck, trapped in the mid-card, unable to break through to the main event level, no matter how hard he worked or how good his matches were. Flair during this period was the king of the company, the undisputed top star, the man who held the world championship more often than not. Austin has spoken many times over the years about the glass ceiling in WCW, the invisible barrier that kept certain wrestlers from ascending to the top of the card. The older guard, the established stars, including Flair prominently among them, were protective of their spots. They were not willing to let new talent break through and potentially replace them. Flair often had influence on the booking committee, the group of people who decided who won and lost and who got pushed. He represented the establishment, the old way of doing things, the system that rewarded loyalty and tenure over hunger and innovation. Austin felt that frustration deeply, viscerally. There are verified clips from this era of Flair interviewing Austin before matches, short backstage segments that aired on WCW television. The power dynamic in these segments was painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. Flair held the microphone. Flair controlled the conversation. Austin was the hungry upstart trying desperately to get a word in, to make his case, to prove he belonged. This real-life resentment, this genuine frustration with the system and with the people who controlled it, fueled the anti-establishment character Austin would later develop and perfect in WWE. Stone Cold was not just a gimmick. It was Austin channeling years of being held down, of being told he was not good enough, of watching less talented people get opportunities because they fit the mold better. There is a common misconception about a quote regarding Austin and Flair that needs to be corrected. People often claim that Austin said working with Flair was like taking a night off, implying that Flair made matches easy because he was so smooth and professional. But that is not accurate. The phrase taking a night off was actually used by Flair himself, directed at The Undertaker in the 2002 promo we discussed earlier. Austin's actual commentary on Flair over the years has focused primarily on Flair's cardio and stamina. Austin, whose style was built around brawling and short, intense bursts of action, admitted with genuine respect that Flair's stamina was superhuman. Flair could wrestle 60 minutes without blowing up, without getting tired, without losing a step. Austin preferred shorter matches, 10 to 15 minutes of high-impact action, because his body could not sustain the longer format. When Austin and Flair finally overlapped in WWE in 2002, after Austin had become the biggest star in the entire industry, the dynamic had completely shifted. Austin was now on top. Flair was the aging veteran, the legend from the past trying to find relevance in a new era. They had several on-screen confrontations involving the co-owner storyline, verbal sparring matches that played on their history, but their in-ring chemistry was affected by Austin's physical deterioration. His neck was a mess from years of taking pile drivers and bumps. He was in constant pain. And in June 2002, shortly after a program with Flair and the NWO faction, Austin famously walked out of WWE. He took his ball and went home, as people said at the time, citing burnout and creative frustration with the direction his character was being taken. The takeaway from Austin's story is clear and unambiguous. Flair Flair was greatness. There is no question about his talent or his importance to the industry, but he was also gatekeeping. He represented the system, the establishment, the old guard that protected its own interests. And for someone like Austin, who wanted desperately to break through and reach his potential, Flair was the ceiling he had to shatter, not through cooperation or mentorship, but through revolution. Now let us return to Mick Foley and close the loop on that controversy we opened with. The relationship between Flair and Foley is unique among all the stories in this video because their first encounters were completely overshadowed by legitimate, real-life animosity. In his autobiography published in 2004, Flair referred to Foley dismissively as a glorified stuntman. He said that Foley lacked actual wrestling talent and that his hardcore style, the death matches and the thumbtack bumps and the barbed wire, was a cheap substitute for real ability. That comment deeply wounded Foley on a personal level. Foley had always prided himself on being more than just a guy who took crazy bumps. He saw himself as a storyteller, a psychological performer who used violence as a tool to create emotional investment. He felt that Flair dismissed everything he had worked for, everything he had suffered for, with a single contemptuous phrase. Before the animosity reached its peak in WWE, the two had worked together in World Championship Wrestling in 1993. Flair was the babyface champion during this period, playing a rare good guy role. Cactus Jack, Foley's character, was part of a violent faction and often fought Vader, another monster heel. Their interaction was mostly tangential. They shared screen time but rarely worked extended programs directly with each other. But even then, the stylistic clash was evident to anyone watching. Flair represented the sport of professional wrestling, the athleticism and the technical skill and the cardio. Cactus represented the violence, the chaos, the willingness to destroy your own body to get a reaction. The true explosion of their rivalry happened in WWE in 2006, years after both had seemingly moved past their primes. They engaged in a feud that blurred the lines between fiction and reality more than almost any other program in modern WWE history. It was what is known in the business as a worked shoot, where real grievances and real emotions are incorporated into a fictional storyline. Flair and Foley attacked each other in promos with unusual venom, referencing the glorified stuntman comment directly and openly. Foley talked about how much the insult had hurt him. Flair doubled down, insisting that his style was superior and that hardcore wrestling was for people who could not actually wrestle. This built to an I Quit match at SummerSlam 2006, a stipulation where the match cannot end until one man verbally submits. The match was an absolute bloodbath. Barbed wire wrapped around baseball bats, thumbtacks scattered across the ring, both men bleeding profusely, and in the most shocking visual of the entire match, the refined and gentlemanly Ric Flair, the man who had spent his entire career in trunks and robes looking immaculate, took a back bump directly into a pile of thumbtacks. They embedded in his back, dozens of them, creating a horrifying image. Flair, at age 57, with his body already breaking down from decades of abuse, engaged fully in Foley's hardcore style to prove a point. He wanted to demonstrate that he could play Foley's game better than Foley could play his. He wanted to show that even in the realm of violence and chaos, the Nature Boy was superior. It was pride. It was ego. It was Flair refusing to concede that any other approach to wrestling could be as valid or as valuable as his own. Foley has said in interviews since that the two eventually reconciled, that they made peace after the feud ended. But their on-screen chemistry, the intensity and emotion of their confrontations, was fueled entirely by genuine friction. The hatred felt real because, on some level, it was real. And the lesson here is unmistakable. Flair's pride pushed him into places he had previously mocked and dismissed. He would risk serious physical pain, would subject his aging body to punishment it could barely handle to win an argument. He would do whatever it took to protect his legacy and his reputation, even if it meant contradicting everything he had previously stood for. Shawn Michaels and Flair first wrestled in December 1991, and their story is one of instant chemistry, followed by a farewell 17 years in the making. This was shortly after Flair had arrived in the WWF with the big gold belt, the physical NWA World Championship that he brought with him from WCW. A match between them aired on Primetime Wrestling on December 16, 1991. At this time, Michaels was still performing as one half of the Rockers tag team, though he was clearly on the verge of breaking out as a single star. Flair was positioned as the top heel in the company, feuding with Hulk Hogan. Reports and reviews from this era indicate that the chemistry between them was immediate and obvious. One observer wrote that Michaels looked like $1 million in the match, and that Flair was terrific working with an enthusiastic, quick, younger opponent. This early match is historically significant because it contrasts so sharply with Flair's matches against Bret Hart from the exact same period. Flair and Hart often struggled to mesh their styles effectively. Hart, trained in the dungeon by his father father, Stu Hart, valued logical progression and realistic execution. He found Flair's routine, the planned spots and theatrical flourishes, to be repetitive and somewhat phony. The matches were fine but never truly clicked the way people expected. But Michaels and Flair, both flamboyant performers who relied heavily on charisma and cardio, clicked instantly. They spoke the same language. They understood each other instinctively. The narrative arc of their relationship concluded 17 years later at WrestleMania 24 in one of the most emotional matches in WWE history. The storyline was that Flair would be forced to retire the next time he lost a match, a stipulation put in place by Vince McMahon. Michaels, who had grown up idolizing Flair and watching him on television, was reluctant to be the executioner. He did not want to be the man who ended the Nature Boy's career. The match itself was spectacular, a perfect blend of athleticism and emotion. But it is the finish that everyone remembers, the moment that has been replayed thousands of times. Before delivering the final sweet chin music super kick that would end the match in Flair's career, Michaels mouthed 3 words: "I am sorry, I love you." Flair was openly weeping, tears streaming down his face, knowing what was coming, and then the kick connected and it was over. This moment was the ultimate acknowledgement of Flair's status as the industry's patriarch, the father figure of modern professional wrestling. It was not just a victory for Michaels, it was a eulogy for the NWA era, for a style of wrestling that was disappearing, delivered by one of the icons of the WWE era. But think carefully about what this story reveals. Flair's legend was so enormous, his presence so overwhelming, that even his retirement became a moment that other wrestlers orbited around. Even at the end, even when he was being forced out, the emotional weight of the moment was about Flair. Michaels had to retire him. Michaels had to deliver the final blow. Michaels had to mouth those words and carry that burden. And the entire emotional narrative overshadowed everything else happening in the company. Flair's identity and ego consumed the story completely, even in defeat, even in his final moment. Hulk Hogan and Flair had a complicated and ultimately disappointing history together. When Flair arrived in the WWF in August 1991, carrying the NWA World Championship with him, a match against Hulk Hogan was immediately considered the biggest dream match in professional wrestling history. The NWA champion versus the WWF champion. The representative of the Southern Territories versus the representative of the national expansion. Logic and business sense dictated that this match should headline WrestleMania 8, but it never happened, at least not on pay-per-view. Instead, the two met in a series of house shows, non-televised events where the company could test the match without committing to it publicly. Specifically, they wrestled at Madison Square Garden on November 30th, 1991, and again on December 29th, 1991. Hogan won both encounters, usually by countout or some kind of controversial finish that protected Flair. But reports and reviews from people who attended these shows suggest that the matches did not draw as well as expected. The buildings were not sold out. The in-ring chemistry was lacking. The styles did not mesh. This led directly to Vince McMahon scrapping the planned WrestleMania main event. He pivoted instead to Flair versus Randy Savage and Hogan versus Sid Justice, two matches that seemed safer and more likely to deliver. The true televised first-time main event for Flair versus Hogan did not happen until WCW, after Hogan signed with the company in 1994. At Bash at the Beach, in Hogan's debut match for the company, he defeated Flair to win the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. This match drew a massive buy rate, proving that the dream match still had commercial viability and that fans were willing to pay to see it. But the actual work rate, the quality of the in-ring performance, was not at the level of Flair's matches with Steamboat or Sting or others. The styles still did not mesh particularly well. The takeaway from this story is important and often overlooked. Flair was not automatic magic with everyone. Sometimes, despite the hype and the expectations, the chemistry just was not there. The dream did not land. And when two massive egos collided, when neither man was willing to fully give in to the other's style, the results were not always what people hoped for. Flair's genius had limits. He could not make every match great. He could not carry everyone. And with Hogan, one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, the pairing never quite worked the way it should have. Bret Hart's first major victory over Flair is unique and somewhat controversial in wrestling history. It happened at a non-televised house show in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on October 12, 1992. In the modern era, world championships almost never change hands at untelevised house shows. It is considered bad business to give away such a significant moment where the television audience cannot see it. But this time, it happened. Hart defeated Flair with the sharpshooter, his signature submission hold, to win his first WWF World Heavyweight Championship. Hart has described the match and the victory as the single most pivotal moment of his entire career. He said that winning the WWE title from Ric Flair in Saskatoon was the greatest moment of his career, greater than any WrestleMania main event, greater than any other accolade. The moment it happened, he knew no one could ever take it away from him. He had beaten the man, the standard bearer, the yardstick by which all champions were measured. But Hart's autobiography, published years later, is surprisingly critical of Flair's in-ring style, despite the importance of that victory. Hart was a graduate of the rigorous and painful Hart Dungeon training system. He valued logic above all else, realism, snug execution where moves looked and felt legitimate. He criticized Flair's routine extensively, calling it repetitive and phony. The planned spots, the signature flip over the turnbuckle where Flair would run at his opponent, get backdropped over the top, land on the apron, and then get clotheslined to the floor. The begging off, where Flair would drop to his knees and plead for mercy. Hart saw these things as theatrical crutches, as shortcuts that undermined the believability of the contest. Flair, for his part, viewed Hart as someone who took himself and the business far too seriously, who did not understand that wrestling was supposed to be entertaining first and realistic second. Despite this philosophical friction, despite their very different approaches to the craft, Hart openly acknowledges that beating Flair was the stamp of approval he needed. It was the validation that transitioned him from being a tag team specialist, one half of the Hart Foundation, to being a legitimate world championship level singles performer. So even though Hart did not respect Flair's style, even though he thought Flair's matches were formulaic and predictable, he still needed to beat Flair to legitimize himself in the eyes of the fans and the wrestling world. That is the power Flair held throughout his career. You could hate his routine. You could criticize his methods. You could think his style was outdated, but you still needed his approval and his endorsement to truly make it to the top. So what does all of this tell us about Ric Flair when we step back and look at the entire picture? He was, without question, the universal solvent of professional wrestling. He could adapt to absolutely any style thrown at him. The high-flying, energetic style of Sting, the brawling, violent approach of Mick Foley, the technical precision of Kurt Angle, the power and intimidation of The Undertaker, the pure athleticism of Ricky Steamboat. Flair made it work with all of them. He found a way to create compelling matches and stories regardless of who stood across the ring from him.